I would like to do an introduction to our speaker today, Rabbi Engelmayer. You may have seen his press release in the recent issue of Temple Talks, but I just want to go over that just for those who don't know some of Rabbi Engelmayer's bio. He's the emeritus of Congregation Beth Israel of the Palisades, and has been writing his award-winning column, Keeping the Faith, for the Jewish Standard since the early 1990s. That was last century, if you don't remember. But he's won 6 American Jewish Press Association's awards. He also has a weekly podcast called Keep the Faith with Rabbi Engelmayer. His columns and podcasts deal with contemporary issues through the prism of Jewish law and tradition. He's the editor of Judaism, a quarterly journal of the Jewish life and thought, and is a popular adult Jewish education instructor. He's now leading 2 weekly adult education classes online. Rabbi Engelmayer was ordained in 1967, but he chose to pursue a career in journalism before assuming the pulpit, winning several prestigious journalism awards. He's the author of 8 books, mostly on secular topics, and is at work on several more. His latest book, tentatively titled Judaism for the Disinterested, will be published later this year. So we're glad to have him here. And his topic, which I know people scoffed at to me, about talking about the Exodus, did it happen or didn't it happen? I'm sure the rabbi will get into some Baba Mainzes and also get into some facts about why we follow this story, and if anything, we are a people of stories. And this is perhaps the most famous story of them all. But the question would be, where do we see this in history, the archaeology of the Exodus, and how that might come to be, or was this really one of the best stories we ever wrote? So without that, I welcome Rabbi Shammai Engelmayer to our Bima.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you all for being here and inviting me. I only hope that I don't put everybody to sleep. This is I've got a lot of things to say. It's going to be a while, but I hope it's meaningful, and I hope that it helps give you really wonderful Siddharim and Passovers coming up. Okay, I'll wait for people to sit down. But on Sunday morning, April 8th, wait a minute, I've got to slow this down. This is running faster than it's supposed to. On Sunday morning, April 8th, 2001, the first day of Passover that year, a prominent conservative rabbi in Los Angeles delivered a sermon in which he declared that the Exodus most likely never happened. In support, he cited, quote, virtually every modern archaeologist, unquote, and then added, quote, that the way the Bible describes the Exodus, excuse me, my allergies, that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all, unquote. In fact, he said, archaeologists have never found anything, quote, not one shard of pottery, unquote, to even suggest that the Israelites were ever in Egypt or in the Sinai in the period that they supposedly should have been. The claim was neither new nor original in 2001, yet this rabbi's words that day made headlines around the world. That was because of who he was, Rabbi David Wolpe, and that he spoke those words on the first morning of Pesach was part of his sermon. Wolpe wasn't wrong in saying the Exodus saga didn't occur the way the Torah reports it. But he was wrong in adding, if it happened at all. And he was wrong in declaring that there's no archaeological evidence to support it. I'll come back to that statement at the end of my talk. From the 1930s through the mid-1970s, Most Egyptologists, archaeologists, and other scholars accepted that the Exodus did happen. They just differed about when it happened, but not about whether it happened. From the mid-1970s on, though, we saw the rise of the so-called historical minimalists. I sometimes call them the hysterical minimalists. Scholars who not only argue that the Exodus never happened, they insist that Israel didn't even exist before the 9th century BCE, the 9th century before the Common Era, which means everything from the start of the Torah all the way up beyond the kings, the first kings, we made all that stuff up. They know this, especially about the Exodus, because there's nothing in Egyptian history to support it, they say. The influence of these historical minimalists has grown ever since. They now control the narrative. Preparing for Passover takes a lot of work. And it includes considerable expense as well. And all because of a story that we're told never happened. Well, if it didn't happen, if there was no Exodus, why do we have to go through all the painstaking work and expense of preparing to celebrate a fairy tale? Why do we even need a Seder and its special ritual to mark a made-up story? Why do we have to eat matzah if we'd rather have a bagel? Rabbi Wolpe offered an answer to these questions in his sermon. What matters are the messages in that story, he said, not whether it actually happened. These are messages of freedom for all, equality for all, justice for all, and fealty to the God whose messages those are. I agree with him about those messages, but not with his questioning the authenticity of the narrative, if for no other reason that it obscures those messages. Messages our world desperately needs to hear. If we don't believe in the story, then it's the messages that are irrelevant. And that's a tragedy. Let me state this bluntly. The Exodus did happen, but not exactly the way the Torah describes it. The Torah is not a history book in the ordinary sense. It was, is, and always will be a book of sacred history, written by a sacred historian who views events through a God-centered lens, a lens that sees the hand of God in every event. Let me give you an example from an event that occurred 47 years ago that many of you, I hope, remember, and remember proudly. On July 4th, 1976, the day we here celebrated America's bicentennial, an elite Israeli commando team flew over 2,000 miles of enemy territory to reach the airport at Entebbe in Uganda. Their mission was to rescue more than 100 hostages being held by Palestinian and German terrorists, because those terrorists had vowed to kill all of the hostages at the first sign that an Israeli rescue mission was underway. They had to fly to Entebbe undetected. They knew, of course, that getting to Entebbe undetected was virtually impossible, but they had to try. We're talking about 2,000 miles of flying over territory of people who wanted to see Israel disappear. They succeeded because of something that they couldn't have planned for. The planes they used were C-130 transport jets. There is a nickname for the C-130s. They're called hippos, for hippopotamus. Using those jets posed the problem, though, because the C-130 is a bulky plane, and in its propeller days, it was quite loud. So people on the ground would surely hear them. if they didn't see them, because they had to fly below radar because they didn't want anybody to know that they were coming. So they're flying below radar, making a lot of noise. People on the ground are going to see them. Yet the C-130s went undetected for the entire over 2,000 miles because of a series of violent thunderstorms that covered them and the noise the planes made. For the planes to land at Entebbe meant landing at the southern end of Lake Victoria, which is where the airport runway began. The storm over Lake Victoria, though, was so fierce that Lieutenant Colonel Joshua Shammai, the pilot of Hercules 1, the plane that carried the various rescue teams, told Brigadier General Dan Shomron, who was the on-site mission commander, that there was no way the planes could land at Entebbe. They had to divert to Kenya and scrub the mission. Shomron, who was in the cockpit at the time, turned to go into the cabin to tell his men to stand down. As he opened the door, Shammai said, quote, "It looks like God is on our side tonight." Those were his exact words, and he's testified to that. He said it because at the southern end of Lake Victoria, there was no storm. There was no wind shear to rip the planes apart. There's no question that this actually was what happened. Shammai testified to it. Shomron has testified to that. The historian reports events as they happened, or at least he or she tries to do so. But if ever a sacred historian sits down to record that remarkable tale, it'll be God's hand that sheltered the Hercules transports as they flew to Entebbe. And it'll be God's hand that removed the storm right where it needed to stop so that the planes could land. The Torah is sacred history. Excuse me. It's a record of events that happened, but seen through that special God-centered lens. Excuse me, Bob, can you get me anything to drink? Oh, Bob got me something to drink, and I didn't know. I'm looking through that wrong lens, anyway. Seeing things through that God-centered lens colors how the sacred historian reports on events. Egyptian history, meanwhile, never mentions the Exodus for reasons I'll explain a bit later. But as you'll hear, there is a specific period in Egyptian history that lasted for the same number of years, 430 years to be exact, that the Torah tells us Israel was in Egypt, and it contains events that can be seen as correlating with the Torah's narrative. Of course, if we don't know when something happened, we can't know where to look for proof that it did happen. To locate the period I'm talking about means trying to pinpoint when the Exodus most likely happened, and then working back 430 years to see what events occurred leading up to it. The dating of the Exodus is the subject of so much debate among the scholars who believe that it did happen. And I've never understood why, though. Because the Torah provides several clues, including the biggest one. It tells us that the Israelites were forcefully employed in building the cities of Pithom and Ramesses, two cities in the Nile Delta. We know these two cities as Pi Ramesses or Per Ramesses and Pi Atum or Per Atum. And we know they were built during the reign of Ramesses II, a pharaoh of the 13th century. Ramesses II himself bragged about it on a stone slab known as a stele. And he even said they were built by foreign slaves, some of whom, he said, were, quote, Asiatics, unquote. Asiatics is the term that the Egyptians used for people who came from Canaan and that surrounding area. Most of them were Semites. We're Asian in origin. Keep that in mind. We're not African. Egypt is in Africa, but Abraham's birthplace in Ur of the Chaldees and the land of Israel, they're in Asia. I should also explain what Semite means, because as I was practicing this yesterday with my wife, she said, "You mean they were all Jews?" We hear the word and we think it's a synonym for Jews. That's its most common usage today, I'll agree. But Arabs are also Semites. In the ancient world, first of all, the term Semite doesn't even show up until the late 18th century. In the ancient world, it included Akkadians, Canaanites, and even some Aramaean tribes, and among others. I doubt whether anyone in that world knew that they were Semites. That's what we know them to today. The Egyptians refer to them as Asiatics. In trying to pinpoint when the Exodus occurs, location is another critical factor. Traditionally, the kings of Egypt ruled from Memphis or Thebes, far to the south from Pithom and Ramses and the Nile Delta. The Torah's account, however, requires Egypt's government at both ends of the Exodus to be in the same area as those two cities. Both Joseph at the front end and Moses at the far end have to be able to go back and forth from the palace to Goshen without much trouble and with very little travel time. A capital in the Nile Delta region, in fact, is a staple of the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, the so-called Ramessid era, when Pithom and Ramses were built. That wasn't the case hundreds of years later, those scholars who say otherwise notwithstanding, and it wasn't the case earlier during the 18th dynasty that preceded the Ramessid era. But it was the case in Moses' time, or at the far end, in the Ramessid era, and it was also the case in Joseph's era, at the front end of the story. Because remember, the story depends on two people, on the existence of two people. It depends on the existence of Joseph on the front end and Moses on the far end. Tracing ourselves back from the Ramessid era, we find the Egyptian seat of government located in virtually the same spot, a spot that's not the usual one for Egypt's capitals. Location, though, isn't enough, at least on the front end, because we also have to find conditions that would allow for a Semite, Joseph, to rise to a position of great importance in Egypt's government. And we do find that condition met as well. Tracing our way back 4 centuries, we come to a period in Egyptian history in which the Nile Delta was ruled by those so-called Asiatics, the people history erroneously refers to as the Hyksos. These interloper pharaohs made the Nile Delta their capital seat. As it turns out, the later Ramessid capital was actually built, as I just said, on the very site of the old Hyksos capital, on the very site, not just in the general area. And that's very telling in itself, by the way. The Torah doesn't tell us that. History tells us that. Archaeology tells us that. Placing Joseph within this period also answers a question raised by the basic story. If Joseph's actions saved Egypt from suffering during the 7 years of famine, as the Torah claims, how could a new Pharaoh arise, quote, who knew not Joseph? And how could Egypt have been so ungrateful as to enslave their savior's descendants? With the Hyksos as backdrop, the answer we find is that the Egyptian ruling classes, political and priestly, didn't want to know anything about Joseph or any other Asiatic who participated in the usurpation of native rule. And as I'll discuss shortly, the native pharaohs who finally threw the Hyksos out of Egypt went a long way towards obliterating any trace of them from Egyptian records of all kinds. So now we know in what period to begin our search for proof. It starts with the Hyksos period and it ends in the Ramesside era. At both ends of this period, we find some amazing things. For example, I love this one. At the early end of this chain of years, we find a Semitic pharaoh who very likely was the patriarch Jacob. You heard that right. We'll get back to that too. At the other end, following the death of Merneptah, who's the most likely pharaoh of the Exodus, he was the 13th son of Ramesses II. Following his death, we find in Egypt in a state of economic and political collapse with no army in sight, all of which point to some giant catastrophe that must have occurred. We even find that a usurper briefly seized Egypt's throne from Merneptah's son, Seti II. That usurper's name, by the way, was Amonmas. The second half of his name is his surname, so to speak, is an Egyptian form of the name Moses. This is important because we're told that there's no record of the name Moses in Egyptian records. But that ignores the fact that the name Moses isn't a name by itself. It's just a surname of sorts. It means son of. And there are many instances in the Egyptian records, including the names of several pharaohs of the 18th dynasty. Amonmes's name means son of the Egyptian god Ammon. It's sometimes written Ammon-Moses, as a fact. Even the name Ramesses, think of Yul Brynner, even the name Ramesses contains Moses in it. Ramesses means son of the god Ra. We have no idea what Moses' full name was, but we do know from the Egyptian record that people who carried that surname were often referred to just by that surname. Amonmes, for example, in several places in the Egyptian record is referred to only as Moses or Mas, whatever. Again, the Torah doesn't tell us any of this. History does. The Egypt that existed when Joseph and his family must have arrived there is in chaotic transition. The 12th dynasty had ended on or about 1785 BCE. For the next 220, I hope you're taking notes. For the next 220, there's a test afterwards. For the next 225 years, until the rise of the pharaoh Ahmose and the start of the 18th dynasty, somewhere around 1560 BCE, no one person held sway over the entire nation. Different pharaohs ruled different parts of Egypt at the time, including in the Nile Delta, and that's why there are several dynasties, Egyptian dynasties, that are running concurrently with each other or in parallel. Amos, by the way, also includes the name Moses. His name means son of the moon god Ah. Into this power vacuum came the Hyksos. They began migrating to Egypt somewhere around 1720 BCE. The Egyptologist Donald Redford says that most of them, at least, came from the same general vicinity in Canaan as did the family of Jacob and Joseph. It's here that we begin to understand the difficulties we encounter in trying to trace developments in Egypt, in Egyptian history. As the Egyptologist Sir Alan Gardner put it, at the start of the 18th dynasty, quote, distortion and literary fiction become an established convention of Egyptian historical writing, unquote. Not only, not only did the founders of the 18th dynasty resort to what today we would call fake news, they also undertook a nearly completely successful effort to destroy any records of the Hyksos or their accomplishments. It was into this world that Joseph was thrust when he was sold into slavery. Joseph was a real person, not the invented character so many scholars claim. So says the University of Toronto archaeologist and biblical scholar, Professor James K. Hoffmeyer. He bases that on textual evidence that also suggests, sometimes very strongly, that Joseph's story could only have played itself out during the period of the Hyksos. Missing from the Joseph saga, for example, are direct references to the many gods of Egypt. The one exception is in the mention of Joseph's father-in-law, who was priest to Egypt's creator god Atum, from whom all else came into being. Atum is the god for whom the city of Pitom, Pi-Atum or Per-Atum, was named after. Now, this is also critical. These Asiatics, in a shrewd political move, co-opted the identities of traditional Egyptian gods, giving them the attributes of the gods of their own Semitic pantheon. They also designated the Egyptian god Seth as their chief god. Seth, though, was best known to the native Egyptians, according to the Egyptologist Sir Alan Gardner, as, quote, the murderer of the good god Osiris, but the Hyksos chose to ignore that regrettable aspect. Their version of Seth bore a distinct resemblance to the Semitic god Baal, unquote. Baal being the head of the Semitic pantheon. This elevation of Seth has important ramifications for the Ramesside era, as you'll soon hear. The Hyksos also continued to worship the Semitic goddess Anat Astarte, and that also has ramifications for the Ramesside era. In her case, there was no effort to disguise her Semitic identity. They continued to worship Anat Astarte as a Semitic goddess, period. And so did Ramesses II. We'll get to him later. Then there are the chariots. Joseph's Pharaoh has him, quote, ride in the chariot of his second in command, unquote. This is very telling, because it was the Hyksos who introduced the chariot into Egypt. At this point, here's where we stand. From 1674 BCE, when the reign of the Hyksos pharaoh Salatus supposedly begins, he's the first Hyksos pharaoh that we can be certain about. From then until 1223 BCE, and the death of Merneptah, 451 years pass. The Torah tells us that Joseph's family doesn't arrive in Egypt for 22 years after he arrives there. So subtract 22 from 451. What do you get? 429 years. Torah tells us Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. What follows now is at best a recreation based on existing evidence that's admittedly all too sparse. I present it here as a possibility that fits the facts that we do have, not as a fact in itself. You'll have to decide whether to take any of what I say seriously. Regardless of whether what follows is fact or fancy, though, it does reconcile the Torah's version with existing historical data. And since it does that, it establishes the possibility, at least, that there's historical truth to the story that the Torah tells. Joseph is 17 years old when he's sold into slavery. But there's something strange in the way the Torah reports it. 3 times in a very few verses, beginning of Parshat Miketz, it emphasizes that Joseph was sold to an Egyptian man, Potiphar, who was Pharaoh's chief of the guard. 3 times in a very few verses. Think about it. And off Joseph is brought to Egypt and sold into slavery. Person who buys him is an Egyptian officer of the Pharaoh, a high officer of the Pharaoh, no less. So what else would he be if he's not an Egyptian? Yet the text goes out of its way to emphasize that he was. Why? Because by then, the Hyksos are well established in the Delta region, and one of them, Salatus, is serving as Pharaoh. The Torah, it seems, emphasizes that Potiphar is an Egyptian because he's serving a non-Egyptian Pharaoh in an important capacity. At age 30, Joseph comes to face with Salatus himself. The king is so impressed with Joseph's wise advice that he instantly appoints Joseph to the number 2 post in his kingdom. Would an Egyptian pharaoh appoint a Semitic slave who was also a prisoner accused of attempted rape to any high post, much less make him second in command? That's highly likely. But it is something one Semite might do to another Semite, and especially if that Semite had an ulterior motive, which I think was likely. Here's why I say that. 2 years after his appointment as vizier, Joseph sends for his father and his family. That same year, according to my recreation, Salatus dies. Virtually all scholars agree that the name of the new pharaoh, the pharaoh who replaced Salatus, was in part Jacob, Yaakov in Hebrew. This Jacob will rule Egypt for approximately 18 years, at least according to some Egyptologists. The Torah tells us our Jacob lived in Egypt for 17 years and dies in his 18th year. The Egyptologist Sir Alan Gardner says that identifying our Jacob as the Pharaoh Jacob is, quote, the accepted view, unquote. And there is archaeological evidence to his existence, by the way. There's a scarab, several scarabs with his name on it. I think Joseph sent for Jacob because Salatus, for whatever reason, wanted Jacob to succeed him. But that's my own speculation. Of course, we could put this similarity in names down to coincidence, albeit a huge one, if not for the Torah's account of Jacob's burial. The preparations for it and the huge and prestigious funeral party the Torah describes in Bereshit, in Genesis chapter 50, don't make sense if Jacob was merely the father of Egypt's second in command. His was a state funeral on a grand scale. I commend you to look back at the Parsha, chapter 50, and see what I'm talking about. Based on an ancient account of a pharaoh's burial, the renowned biblical scholar Nachum Sarna, who edited Eitz Chaim, by the way, said, quote, Jacob is apparently being accorded royal honors, unquote. That only makes sense if Jacob's funeral was the funeral of a king of Egypt. Joseph lives for another 54 years after his father's death. In this chronology, this would be around the year 1580 BCE. That date is consistent with two curiosities found in the Torah's account of Joseph's death. The first is that Joseph assures his brothers that God will remember them and bring them safely out of Egypt. Such an assurance would seem to be unnecessary, given who Joseph is supposed to be. The second is the simple sentence recording Joseph's death. Quote, and Joseph died at the age of 110, and they embalmed him and placed him in a coffin in Egypt, unquote. There's no mention, though, of a period of public mourning for Joseph or of a state funeral of any kind, as there was for Jacob, and that's very strange. Unlike what they were clearly able to do for Jacob a half century earlier, Joseph's family can't even take him out of Egypt to be buried in Canaan. Instead, Joseph must exact a pledge from his family that they'll take his bones with them when God delivers them from Egypt in the future. Clearly, something significant has occurred, and something has. History tells us that the Hyksos are under full-scale attack by native Egyptian forces. Within 2 years, the Pharaoh Kamos, here's that Moses surname again, the Pharaoh Kamos will push the war against the Hyksos even harder. Kamos was followed by Amos, who completed the route and began Egypt's 18th dynasty. I know Amos sounds like Amos, A-M-O-S. It's A-H-M-O-S-E. For the story to come full circle, though, it requires Moses to appear at the far end, for him to be raised as a prince of Egypt, and for Egypt to end up in a state of almost total collapse. Before any of that can happen, though, a secondary drama must first play out, one that will have a profound impact on Egypt and will set the stage for all that's yet to come in the saga of Israel in Egypt. The sacred historian gives us no events from the years between the death of Joseph and the birth of Moses that we can correlate with events in Egyptian history. They weren't important to him, but we do know what those events were. There were 14 or 15 kings of Egypt in the 18th dynasty, and the problem with the numbers is that one of those 15 was a woman who disguised herself as a man to be Pharaoh for a couple of years. And so scholars go, God forbid there should be a woman Pharaoh. Anyway, so there were either 14 or 15 kings of Egypt in the 18th dynasty, 5 of whom, by the way, bore the surname Moses. But our interest begins with king number 10, Amenhotep IV. In his 4th year, he changed his throne name to Akhenaten, and he attempted to uproot Egypt's traditional religion by instituting a new one that had all the trappings of monotheism. Probably wouldn't have been monotheism as we understand it, but monotheism would have been the final result if it had been allowed to continue. Akhenaten's religion is known as Atenism, or the worship of one god named Aten, a name, by the way, that is in no way related to the name Adonai. We're not certain what Akhenaten meant by Aten, being the only god. What's clear, though, is that he was heavy-handed in his approach to his religious revolution, and that revolution did not survive him. The resentment it produced, especially among the Egyptian priesthood and the societal elite, was too strong for his immediate successors to overcome, and virtually no record of their reigns exists because of the Egyptian habit of erasing anything they prefer to see disappear. As far as the Egyptian official Egypt was concerned, Akhenaten was followed on the throne by an army general named Horemheb, who more than anyone else in that period made it his task to wipe out any traces of Akhenaten and his heresy. He also had his name inscribed on various monuments over the names of the kings who preceded him to make sure that nobody would remember those kings. And one of them, by the way, was Tutankhamun. If Israel was in Egypt at that time, Horemheb would see its belief in one God to be a sure threat to Egypt. That brings us to 2 more of those annoying coincidences that run through the story. One of these involves what historians refer to as the Amarna period. That's because it was at a place called El Amarna that Akhenaten established his new capital to go with his religious reform. He called his capital Akhetaten. He's very original. Akhenaten probably never heard of the name El Amarna. That name accrued to the site just 3 centuries ago when its existence was discovered, and there was a tribe living there known as the Beni Amran. We know virtually nothing about this tribe, including how it's got its name. Beni means the children of in Arabic. So the tribe was known as the children of Amran, whoever he was. In Hebrew, that name works out to be the B'nai Amram. And the Torah gives us the names of 3 B'nai Amram. Aaron, Miriam, Moses. Our Bible, the Tanakh, hints at the likelihood that Amram wasn't actually their father, but that's for a different discussion. Is there a connection between the Bnei Amram and the Beni Amran? No one has studied that as yet, at least as far as I know. Boy, I would like to see somebody do that. The second nagging fact in coincidence is this. Across the Nile from Amarna is the ancient town of Malawi. It exists today, and it existed back then. In Coptic, the name Malawi means city of textiles, or it's supposed to be. Malawi, though, is a name made up of two separate words, Mal and Lawi. And the literal translation of Mal and Lawi is city of the Levites, the city of the people that gave birth to Amram and Moses, the city of the family that tradition says were our religious functionaries during our time in Egypt. Did Akhenaten locate his capital at Amarna because it was so near a city populated by those very people? Was it the original Beni Amran who influenced Akhenaten's religious reforms? Is that why Israel was enslaved when Akhenaten's religious revolution collapsed? We may never know, because as far as I know, no one's looking into that either. Wouldn't you think that's a little bit curious? Don't you want to know more, and nobody seems to be looking at it? Clearly, though, Horemheb would want the Hebrews out of the way if they exhibited any kind of monotheistic tendencies. Horemheb then would be the new Pharaoh who rose, who knew not Joseph, because he didn't want to know Joseph or any other Hebrew or any other Asiatic. Because of his advanced age, Horemheb chose another general to rule as co-regent, and that general succeeded Horemheb. That general would launch the 19th dynasty, and we know him as Ramesses I. Either he or his son Seti relocated Egypt's capital back to the very exact spot it had been when the Hyksos ruled. The Ramesses came from the Nile Delta. That raises the intriguing possibility, and don't laugh, give me a chance to get through this. It raises the intriguing possibility that the Ramesside kings were descended from a family that, at the very least, had intermarried with Semites or other Asiatics back in the days when the Hyksos ruled. There's even a hint, a strong one, of this found on a stele. It shows Seti I sacrificing to the god Seth, the god he was named after. Remember, he's the god who killed Osiris. The accompanying text reports that this occurred in Seth's 400th year. Seth was over 2,000 years old by then, for the record, not 400 years. On the other hand, the Hyksos recreated Seth, the one in the image of Baal. He was 400 years old. So Seti I wasn't worshiping the Egyptian god Seth. He was worshiping the Hyksos version of Seth, meaning he was worshiping Baal. Why would an Egyptian name a son either after an Egyptian god who was hated for killing Osiris, much less after a god who was actually recreated in the image of a Semitic god, the head of the Semitic pantheon, no less? Here's another question. How could Moses have passed as a Ramesside prince, which he supposedly did for the first 40 years of his life? One possible answer to both questions is that Moses really was a member of the royal family, albeit likely a distant one, because both he and the royal family were descended from that intermarriage I mentioned a few minutes ago. This would also explain how Ramesses II, again, think Yul-Brynner. This would also explain how Ramesses II could name one of his daughters, who later actually became his principal wife as well. They did things differently in Egypt. How he could name his daughter Bint Anat, which means the daughter of Anat. As I noted earlier, Anat Astarte is not an Egyptian goddess. Even her combined names aren't Egyptian. They're Semitic. Anat is the Semitic goddess of war, while Astarte is the Semitic goddess of love. Ramesses II, in fact, chose Anat to be his warrior goddess every single time he went into battle. Curiously, according to 1 Chronicles, the princess who rescued Moses and raised him as her own was named Bitya. And in some other texts, it refers to her as Batya. Either way, her name means the daughter of God, our God. It's not a stretch to believe that Jewish tradition would change the name of the woman who raised Moses as her own son from daughter of Anat, Bint Anat, to the daughter of God, Bitya. Such a familial tie would explain a number of other mysteries as well, such as why Moses was so quickly accepted at the palace. If Moses passed for an Egyptian, he must have looked like an Egyptian. If Moses passed as a Ramesside prince, he must have looked like a Ramesside prince. It would explain why Miriam had no trouble entering the palace grounds, going straight up to the princess who just picked Moses out of the lake, out of the river or whatever, and addressing her. No one tried to stop her. She went right up, and nobody said, "But who are you, little girl?" Nothing. It would also explain why Moses later was able to confront Pharaoh so many times without ever suffering any kind of consequence. Or why from the first time that he and Aaron approached Pharaoh after Moses came back from Midian, the king knew their names. As fanciful a connection as it sounds, it can't be dismissed for the reasons I just gave. That brings us to Merneptah. Under my proposed chronology, 429 years passed from the time Jacob arrived in Egypt until the Exodus. And according to Egyptian history, the Pharaoh at that time was Merneptah, 13th son of Ramesses II. To be fair, the reigns of Egypt's pharaohs are always approximations. What's relevant is not that the numbers are an exact match, but that they're close enough to each other to fit into the timeline. Here's another one of those coincidences we find in the narrative. Ramesses II is believed to have reigned from 1279 BCE to 1213 BCE, for a total of 66 years. Merneptah is believed to have reigned from 1213 BCE to 1200 BCE, for a total of 13 years. 66 and 13 equals 79. How old was Moses when the Exodus occurred? 80. Torah tells us Moses lived under 2 kings. First, he had to escape Egypt, was the first king. After that king died, and Moses was sent back by God, there was a second king. Moses lives under 2 kings. There are no other 2 kings that you could put together that come up with the numbers 66 and 13. Anyway, when Ramses died, he left Egypt at its strongest. Its influence covered much of North Africa and the Asian Middle East. And that's why he's known as Ramesses the Great. According to Egyptian history, Merneptah did nothing to diminish the influence. Yet when he died, Egypt was plunged into a darkness from which it would never again fully emerge. Among other things, history tells us that Lebanese invaders successfully invaded and seized territory in the Nile Delta. It tells us that It tells us that there also was a great deal of civil unrest throughout Egypt after Merneptah's death, and that Amenmes seized the throne for a few years. Apparently as well, there was no army to speak of immediately available for Seti II to call on to challenge any of this. Not the invasion, not the civil unrest, not the usurpation of his throne. As for Egypt's economy, which remember was built on slavery, as for Egypt's economy, it was destroyed. History tells us that it would take until the reign of Ramesses III, who was the second pharaoh of Egypt's 20th dynasty, to recover. He wasn't related to the Ramesses, by the way. He just wanted to associate his name with Ramesses the Great. All these things apparently happened immediately after Merneptah's death. The Egyptian records confirm that these things happened, but not why they happened. The Torah, however, offers an answer. The God of Israel had brought Egypt to its knees. That brings me to an interesting document found in the Rijksmuseum in Leiden, the Netherlands. It was unearthed in the late 19th century, and it's referred to as Leiden Papyrus I 344. Known also as the Admonitions of Ipuwer. It's unquestionably a document written in the Ramesside era. No one challenges that. It also unquestionably details a series of horrendous events, from the Nile turning to blood, not blood red, mind you, the Nile turning to blood, to a deadly hailstorm, to the sudden death of so many people that they had to be buried in the streets where they dropped, to slaves looting Egypt as they made their escape. There also are intimations in it of a pillar of fire and a calamity involving what Ipuwer refers to as pouring water that resulted in the deaths of Pharaoh and many others. Given that this document clearly dates to the Ramesside era, it's tempting to say that it's the first piece of external evidence, contemporary evidence no less, that the Exodus happened, and that it happened in much the same way the Torah describes it. No scholars are willing to make such a claim. They claim instead that the document is merely a copy made of an earlier document dating back more than 1,000 years. But your guess is as good as mine as to how they know this. The evidence that they cite isn't very convincing. It's only conjecture. There is no hard evidence that they are able to supply to prove their point. They're just guessing that it's a copy. As with so much else involving ancient Egypt, we'll never know the truth about this document without unearthing of new evidence. But that's another one of our coincidences. A document written in the Ramesside era that says so many things that correspond to the story that the Torah gives about the Exodus. The point, though, is this. There's nothing in the Exodus story that can't be explained as natural events. The Nile becomes contaminated in some way, causing the aquatic creatures in it to come out onto the dry land. Whatever can't live outside the water dies, and their carcasses attract insects of all kinds and the diseases they carry and so on. Either a hamsin, an incredibly powerful sandstorm that can last for 3 days or more, or a solar eclipse blot out the sun, which represents the sun god Ra. Either way, especially after all the other calamities, Egyptians would be frozen with fear because it would appear that their chief god, Ra, has been successfully attacked. And then, so many people start to die all around them in the streets, according to Ipuwer. Science, meanwhile, offers an explanation for the 10th plague. Given everything that happened, food in Egypt would be scarce. Meanwhile, the grain stored in the granaries would have become contaminated by some deadly fungus. There are actually some scholarly articles about this in various peer-reviewed journals. Egypt's elite would be the first ones to raid those granaries to get food for themselves and also for their most trusted servants and for their best animals, etc. And most of them would die. The lower ranks of the society, seeing these people dying, wouldn't touch the grain, even though the grain but it doesn't matter. I don't want to take up much more time explaining this. I always thought this was a bit of irony, by the way. Imagine this, if these scientists are right. The granaries that Joseph created to save Egypt are the same granaries that in the end give Israel its exit papers and punishes Egypt for what it does. Before I finish, I want to return to Rabbi Wolpe's claim that nothing archaeological has ever been found in Egypt or Sinai to corroborate the Exodus narrative. That claim should have flown out the window in the mid-1980s. I urge you all to explore the work of Professor Emanuele Annati, an Italian Jewish archaeologist with great credentials, by the way, who spent most of the last 50 years exploring a single site in Sinai, site known as Har Karkam, Mount Karkam, which he identifies as, quote, the mountain of God, unquote. His very convincing 1986 book of that name has been updated with each new find, and they are plentiful. Annati's incredible work is detailed at www.harkarkom.com. Here's an interesting fact about Har Karkom. Each year, people flock to the site on December 21st, the shortest day of the year, to view a natural phenomenon that they want to believe is the burning bush that Moses saw. It appears only on the afternoon of that day, one day every year, and it does look like a bush is burning behind a little rock form. I have a photo of it that appeared in the New York Times on January 2nd, 2022. Anybody who wants to take a look at it. There's so much more to discuss, but I'm going to leave it here. The Exodus happened. Maybe it didn't happen precisely the way the sacred historian recorded it, but it happened. Although I think Rabbi Wolpe was wrong in disputing that. He was 100% right about the messages in that story. Messages of freedom for all, equality for all, justice for all, and fealty to the God whose messages those are. As I said at the beginning of this long dissertation, these are messages our world desperately needs to hear. They're also the messages we must emphasize at our Sidarim this week and in all the Seders to come. That's why we celebrate Passover and why we remember the event. But more important, to remember what that event means for us and for our world. But when we think of the Exodus story as a fairy tale, and then couple that with all of the restrictive and sometimes even silly rules that rabbis have conjured up over the last 2,000 years to make it ever more difficult to celebrate Pesach, these are all that we think of when Pesach approaches. And that's truly sad. Thank you again for inviting me. Thank you for putting up with this long explanation of why I believe the Exodus happened. And if anybody has any questions, I will be glad to answer them in the time that we have left, which is not much. We have 30 seconds, I think. And thank you. And here is the photograph that the Times ran of this unbelievable phenomenon. And by the way, people hadn't noticed it for centuries after centuries. It was only discovered, I think, in the 20th century at one point. Somebody walked by and saw it at that particular time, told other people about it. They came back and they didn't see anything. For some reason, they just thought, well, let's go back on December 21st again, the next one. And there it was again. Okay.
Questions for Rabbi? You have a question I would like to ask? I'm going to ask you to speak in the microphone because otherwise you can't be heard on the streaming. The people on streaming can't be heard.
I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the Hyksos, like where they were supposed to be coming from. I'm not sure I understand that. Like, if they were supposed to came over and took over and became like head of part of Egypt.
I'm having trouble hearing, so
Oh.
can somebody repeat the question for me? Bob, I'm sorry, I apologize, but my hearing aids aren't the best.
Where did the Hyksos come from and why were they?
Where do the Hyksos come from? They come from mainly the Canaan area.
So would they have been Jewish people mixed? I'm not.
There were various people. There were a whole, the various tribes or nations that existed in Canaan at the time.
You just stand by the microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. The various nations that existed in Canaan at the time. We have there were 7 Canaanite nations.
Somebody have a question?
They came from those nations. They also came from the close part of the Levant, the northern border of Israel and Lebanon. From that slight area around there, all of those people were considered Semites. Going up at times as far as Persia, not Persia itself, but below it. And they didn't call them Semites. Again, they did not call them Semites. The Semites was a term that scholars gave to these people in the late 18th century, early 19th century. Anyone else want to take a stab at it?
He's talking.
Your turn.
Rabbi, there is a theory that Hebrews possibly went through the peninsula, and that's why we can't find proof that there were millions or hundreds of thousands of people going through Arabian Peninsula.
I'm sorry, Bob, repeat it for me, please.
There's a theory that the Jews went through a peninsula that doesn't exist anymore, and that's why we have no proof.
No, this is where
The Jews went
Saudi
through-
Arabia is now.
I didn't hear you.
Arabian Peninsula, do you hear such?
Oh, yeah. I don't know. I couldn't answer that.
Okay.
But there are a lot of theories about where we come from. I'll give you an example.
Not where we
Where, again, as I said, they say that we didn't even exist until the 9th century BCE. That was just a bunch of disparate tribes that got together in the 9th century. All right, so how do you explain our history? Well, they come up. Remember I told you about this Pharaoh Jacob? One of the historians actually, or these whatever, actually said, we stole him from Egypt and made him our patriarch in our stories because we needed somebody to put in there. So we took this Jacob and made him our patriarch. They got really great ideas.
Is any or all of your presentation available in print or video?
Is my presentation available in print and media?
Yeah, I'd love to have it.
I could take my notes, and I got a lot of it already written up, so I'd be glad to send it to anybody who wants it. I'll send it to Bob, and Bob will send it out to everyone. Thank you for asking.
So, yes, very, very complex to listen to and to try to understand. But I'm wondering whether the fact that there might be this poisonous fungus that could have been responsible for the deaths of so many, did that then somehow morph into the idea that we should clean out our house every year so completely so there's never anything that might be contaminated?
I missed half of that, I'm sorry.
Did the fungus in Egypt, is that the predecessor for our cleaning our houses out so that we don't have any fungus at Passover?
We don't have what needs.
So we don't have any disease in our houses today because.
Oh, yeah, no, we don't have any, right, because we clean out. Well, that's one of the side benefits of the spring cleaning. You know, I think spring cleaning must have begun with us. But it's a good thing. Take a look at all the food that you're getting out of the refrigerator. Look at the expiration dates.
Having taken a course with Dr. Ira Spar, who's not here today, on Egypt, I can tell that Rabbi Engelmayer did a lot of study to make this happen. The other thing it's so hard for us to wrap our heads around in trying to understand the history of Egypt, he talked about 20 dynasties. 20 dynasties cover so many years that you can't understand where in the history of Egypt this small fragment of time is. For us, it sounds like a lot of time. In the history of Egypt, it's a blip on radar. For us, it's a big deal, as I said, with this story which we've come and obviously passed through generations to make it amazing. So one of the things I often think about is that, okay, we've been passing this story on from generation to generation to generation. So how many generations from the first time the story first came about? And we've done a good job of making this, so, you know, this story has roots, and deep roots, and roots that connect in a variety of ways. And I'm sure it's morphed in a variety of ways. About such as simple things as the four sons, or the, you know, what kind, the simple son, the wicked son, so on and so forth, and how that's changed over time. There's an article in the Standard about that.
Manishtan has changed.
Manishtan has changed. So much has changed from its original, but its roots are still there. The idea of slavery to freedom, of tyranny, you know, of escaping tyranny and God's hand. And we see God mentioned so many times as the deliverer, the one who delivered us from slavery. It's in our Kiddush. It's in through all of our tradition today, which has been around for thousands of years. The delivery of slavery to freedom from slavery. So the roots of this are enormous. So I didn't know where the rabbi was going today. I thought he was going to argue about my last Seder, where my uncle said this and my aunt said that, and this one doesn't believe this one because he came from this mixed marriage and so on and so forth. I didn't know what kind of an article he was going to talk about, because the rabbi does have a propensity to do that too. But we didn't get into that kind of mishigas. So to get into the history lesson could be overwhelming, and I can understand and appreciate that. But the idea that Rabbi Welpe's comments about could it have happened, did it happen, and the fact that the Egyptologists and archaeologists in a place that left incredible records about everything and anything, this particular one doesn't have great detail or anything we can put our hands on, and we do work hard to get our hands on things by constantly digging things up. So it always raises the question about this blip on the radar, why wasn't it there? Well, maybe because it was such a blip on the radar that over the span of time, it was not such a big deal. It might have been a big deal at the moment, but the pharaohs rose and fell, and they were attacked. And we think about, you know, Yul Brynner and the movie, which was on TV, I think, last night. We think about Egypt, and of course, it was the power of its time. It was the biggest population on the planet at its time. And how could it have changed and fall? But it did. It rose and it fell. And entire populations rose and fell along with the issue of the Hyksos, which the rabbi mentioned, that why did the Israelites or the Hebrews become a threat? And why did they have to be brought into slavery? Why was this such a big deal? It was because there were outside invaders who took Egypt down. They could have been another threat, and because Pharaohs, dependent upon their wealth and their armies and their support, did not want to be invaded, because they were invasions from the south, Nubia, where the gold came, and there were invasions from the north, and eventually from farther into Asia there, where they were threatened before. So it was not a surprise that the Hebrews were a threat, and this threat could have been tried to be put down. And the Pitom and Ramses, as the rabbi said, were just granaries, places where Joseph had worked before to store all the grain. Of course, he then took over all the grain from everybody, charged them for the grain he stored, and then stole all their land and took all that back into the power of the Pharaoh at the time. So Joseph was thought of as extraordinarily acceptable in Egypt, but he couldn't have been a friend to the Hebrews so much because he stole everything from everyone and all their land and all their food and charged them all for it. So the big revolt was, did we leave? Did we escape? Did we run away? Did we really challenge Pharaoh, was Egypt destroyed? Well, you heard what the rabbi said. Could have been a time where there was not, the Pharaoh was challenged to the point that he got rid of this, and then another Pharaoh take over. You wanted to ask another question? That's a whole other lecture. We're not going down that road. Remember, this is a story. Remember, right? This is a story. We have to remember that stories, we played telephone all before. Play telephone for 2,000 years. What do you think the story's going to look like? So who knows whether it was the Reed Sea, whether they went, they went into the marsh and they drowned, and of course it looked like the reeds were blown by the wind, so it looked like a parting of, and whatever movie maker wants to make a thing of it. But obviously they come back with some roots, because we have, the earliest part, tomorrow, what do you chant with? The Song of the Seas, right? The Song of the Seas is a song and they made a song which had roots because they did everything in writing. And they remembered this song. And they danced and they celebrated, and the timbrels and everything else about this was a big deal. So something happened which was a big deal. Exactly did the water part? I don't know, it sounds good, how it might have been. You had a question?
I do not have a question.
Oh,
I have a comment.
go.
Okay. He knows I'm the PR guy. If you all like what you heard today, there's an adult ed course that Rabbi Engelmayer gives online virtually, and I would encourage you to all go to www.shammai.org, and you can get more of this. A number of us participate already, and it's infrequent, but there's more where this came from. Advertisement concluded. Thank you.
Joe.
Just a comment to get back to Entebbe. Ben-Gurion very famously said that Jews were not supposed to rely on miracles, but to be a realist in Israel, you have to believe in miracles.
Miracles are part of who we are. And that,
Except that our sages say you're not allowed to believe in miracles.
don't depend on them anyhow, I really thank everyone for being here. Thank you for listening and participating. It's wonderful to have you, and Aziz and Pechach to all of you.